In this video, we're going to be switching from right triangles to what are called oblique triangles. And oblique triangles are just triangles that are not right angled. SOHCAHTOA can only be used in right angled triangles. So if your triangles are not right angled, you'll have to use something called either the sine law or the cosine law. There are two versions of the sine law, and they're really just the same, just flipped upside down. And you're going to end up making two fractions and then cross multiplying to solve. If you are solving for a side, you're going to use this version of the formula, and it's side A over the sine of the angle opposite equals side B over the sine of the angle opposite. If you're solving for an angle, it's the same formula, just flipped upside down. To make your calculations easier, it's always easiest to remember that whatever you're solving for, if it's a side, your sides are going to be up at the top, and if it's an angle, your angles are going to be up at the top. The other thing you need to remember is that sides are labeled with lowercase letters and angles are labeled with uppercase letters. So we'll show you how this looks in an example. So one thing I want to remind you is, as I just said, angles are uppercase letters. Sides, like this, are lowercase letters, and the sides and the angles that are opposite to each other have the same letter. So angle C is opposite side C. Angle A, this would be side A. And if this is angle T, this would be side T. Now, in order to use the sine law, the first thing you want to do is make sure you have a matching set of an angle and a side. If you do not have a matching set of an angle and a side, you would not be using the sine law. So we know angle A and we know side A, so that is a matching set. As well, you need to know one other piece of information, either a side or an angle. In this case, we know side C. So that is our other set we're going to be using. As well, what you are solving for, which in this case is the value of side C, what you're solving for, you need to know the opposite piece of information. So if you do not have a matching set of knowing an angle and its opposite side, or if what you are solving for, you do not have the opposite piece of information, then you cannot use the sine law. You'll be using the cosine law, which is what we'll get to on the next day. So you want to be able to make two ovals like this and have three pieces of information known and one piece of information that you don't know. Now, to fill out the formula, that's going to be your first step. Since our matching set is side A, our matching set is side A, and what we're solving for is side C, we're going to be using this formula here. Even though the formula says A over sine A equals B over sine B, you can switch these letters to whatever. This could be P over sine P and K over sine K. It just depends on what the letters are. All right, so to get the formula, you always want to start with what you're solving for. So we are solving for side C. So that's what you start with. So that's a little c. Sometimes I do it as a script, so I know that that's little c. And it's going to be over sine of angle C. And in our diagram, we're also going to be using A's. So sides are on the top, so it's little a, so side A, over sine of angle A, which is a capital. So the letters you get here depend on which two sets you're going to be using. So whatever you're solving for, that goes here. And then the opposite information goes on the bottom. And then the second triangle is the matching set that you have. Make sure if you're solving for a side, you put the sides on the top, and if the angles will go on the bottom. The next step is to substitute in the values. Line up your equal signs. So we don't know what little c is, which is side C, but we do know that angle C is 75 degrees. So that's going to be side C over the sine of angle C. Oops, we know angle C. So it's going to be sine of 75. And little a is side A, which is 6, over the sine of angle A, which is 58. So it's 6 over sine of angle A, which is 58. Now, what you're going to do is cross multiply. Now, just watch what I'm doing first. Don't write this down yet. Just watch what I'm doing first. When you cross multiply, you're taking this top and multiplying it with this bottom. So it's going to be C times sine 58 equals this top being multiplied with this bottom. 6 over sine 75. Then, to isolate C, you need to divide both sides by sine 58. Because then those would cancel. So then, to solve for C, you would, in your calculator, take 6 times sine 75 divided by sine 58. And that would give you C is approximately equal to 6.8. So that's kind of the long way of doing it. A shorter way of doing this is if you notice the sine 58 got multiplied with the C and got moved over to the left side of the equal sign. Then you divided by sine 58, so the sine 58 ended up back in the denominator of the right side. So something else that you can do to make your life a little bit easier is when you have C over sine 75 equals 6 over sine 58. Instead of doing a full cross multiply, you can do what we call a half cross multiply. So because that sine 58 is going to end up back down at the bottom, the denominator on the right side anyway, you can just take this sine 75 and multiply it with the numerator of the second fraction. So you could just do C equals 6 times sine 75 over sine 58. And you end up getting here exactly what you had here. So you end up just saving a little bit of work here. So you could do a half cross multiply, and then you end up getting that same answer of C is approximately equal to 6.8, and of course we should put in our units. So in a half cross multiply, really what you're doing is just multiplying both sides by the denominator of what you were solving for. So what we're solving for is c. So we're going to multiply both sides by sine 75. So when you multiply this side by sine 75, it cancels out. And then when you multiply this side by sine 75, it occurs right there. So that's how you solve for a side. It does not matter whether you do the full cross multiply or the half cross multiply. Either one is fine. Now, to solve for an angle. First thing you want to do is to make sure that you have a matching set. Right here is your matching set. And we are solving for angle G. So if we're solving for angle G, we want to make sure we have side G, which we do. So we have our two ovals, one with what we're solving for and its opposite piece of information, and one matching set. That's how you know that you're able to use the sine law. So our formula is then going to look like this, with the angles on the top and the sides on the bottom. Since we're solving for angle G, it's going to be sine G over side G equals sine D over side D. So sine of angle G over side G equals sine of angle D over side D. And your next step is going to be to substitute in the values, line up your equal signs. So we don't know what angle G is, so we're going to leave this as sine of angle G. We know that side G is opposite angle G, so side G is equal to 6, so that's over 6. And it's sine of angle D, which is sine 75, over side D, which is 7. So sine of 75 over 7. Now, if you're going to do a full cross multiply, then you're going to take this bottom and multiply it with this top. So it's going to be 7 sine G equals this bottom multiplied with this top, 6 sine 75. Now, this is where you have to be careful. Sine and G kind of go together right now. So you're not going to isolate G and divide by 7 sine. You're first going to isolate sine G. So you are going to divide both sides by 7. So those cancel out, and that leaves you with sine G. So sine G is equal to 6 sine 75 over 7. Now, again, we're trying to find an angle, and just like with SOHCAHTOA, when you're trying to find an angle, you want to use the inverse. So to find G, it's going to be sine inverse of 6 times sine 75 over 7. So in your calculator, to get that sine inverse, remember you have to take either shift sign or second function sign. However you get that button on top of your sign. So get sine inverse bracket 6 times sine 75 divided by 7. So in your calculator, this is what you're going to type. Either shift or second, sine, and then bracket 6 times sine 75 divided by 7, close the bracket, equals. That's how you're going to type that into your calculator, and that's going to give you approximately, and again it's an angle, so you're going to round it to 1 decimal place, 56 degrees. Now remember, you can do a half cross multiply instead, because the 7 that you multiplied with this to move to the left, when you isolated sine g, it ended up back to where it started from. So to do a half cross multiply, what you can do is just multiply both sides by the denominator of what you're solving for. So a half cross multiply would mean you would just take the 6 and multiply it. So multiply both sides by the denominator here. So if you multiply this by 6, the 6 cancels, and if you multiply this by 6, it's 6 times sine 75. So your sine g over 6 equals sine 75 over 7. Your half cross multiply means your 6 comes up and multiplies here. So you have sine g equals 6 sine 75 over 7. And then g will be sine inverse of 6 sine 75 over 7. Kind of run out of space. So g is approximately equal to 56 degrees. And like I said before, you don't need to do both of these solutions. Just do one of them. Do a full cross multiply or a half cross multiply. Just want to remind you though, if you are solving for a side, you want to use this formula. If you are solving for an angle, you want to use this formula. And the other thing I want to remind you of is you use sine law if you have a matching set of information, so an angle and its opposite side known, and if the piece of information you're solving for, you have the opposite piece of information. You will get some questions though where you may not have some of this information, but what you might have is a second angle. Or let's say if you had this question, you might get this question where you don't have 58, so don't copy this down, but you may have this question where you don't have the 58, but you know that this angle is 47. So in this case, you don't have a matching set because you don't have this angle and you have this side. But because you know this angle and this angle, you could figure this angle out by the fact that all three angles add up to 180. So if you have this angle and this angle, you can solve for this angle by subtracting these from 180. So sometimes it doesn't look like it's a sine law question, but it actually is. So there's two ways to know if it's a sine law question. Again, like I said, you need to have a matching set of information, or you can figure out a matching set. And the piece of information you're solving for, you need to know the opposite information. So this will occur in one of these situations. If you know two angles and a side, it doesn't matter if the side is In this case, this indicates that the side is in between the two angles you know, or this indicates that the side is not in between the two angles you know. So if you know two angles and a side, it doesn't matter where the side is, or if you have two sides and an angle, and the order here is important. The A is not in between the S's, so that means the angle you know is not in between the two sides. So for instance, if you had this side, and if the angle you knew here, that would be side, angle, side. So that would be SAS. That is not a case that you would use the sine law. So if you know two sides and an angle, two angles and a side, you can use the sine law. Or if you know two sides and an angle that is not in between the two sides, you would use the sine law.